Well, let's talk a bit more about the role of women in the military at that time. We can speak to the author and historian Elisabeth Shipton, who joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us. So just tell us about the role of women at that time around D-Day.
Well, looking at the nurses and the role of the medical staff, we had nurses in the hospitals on the south coast waiting to receive patients from the landings, and those first patients came within the first 36 hours. And then the ladies that we were just hearing about in that video, they were on a hospital ship outside of the French coast. But we also have hospitals, entire units of medics being transported over to Normandy in the weeks that followed the landings. So we have nurses who, some of whom had to wade through the water onto the beaches, just like the men. Yeah. And they went and they supported the hospitals, which were tented hospitals just further inland in Bayeux, where the commemorations have been going on today. And we also know that there were female doctors who went over, and conscription for women had been brought in at the end of 1941. So we think that there's probably about nearly 500,000 women in 1944 who were working for the military services in some capacity.
And there were some extraordinary stories of the courage of women who were dropped behind enemy lines to build up an intelligence picture inside Nazi-occupied France.
Yes, we have. So the Special Operations Executive was established in 1940, and when Britain and her allies were shut out of France with the fall of Dunkirk, they had to come up with a way in which they could build up a picture of what was going on in France. And so Churchill had quite an influence over this. The idea was that agents, both men and women, were going to be dropped into the occupied territory. They looked for people who were probably grown up in the country, so they spoke the language as a local without a British accent or anything, and they could blend in, and they created intelligence networks, and they found out information about how the troops were moving, what kind of defences the Germans were building up. So those defences which the men faced on D-Day, the Germans had had 4 years to develop. So this information is vital, building up a picture for the British, for the Allied invasion force. And when it came to D-Day themselves, it was less about the intelligence networks, but these agents, and there were approximately 50 women dropped in as agents during the period of the war. Their job was to galvanise the pockets of resistance. So they were all very impatient. They were waiting for this longed-for day of liberation. And they just wanted to get stuck in. They wanted to sabotage, they wanted to blow things up. But the agents came in and they said, no, we have to wait until D-Day happens. It's got to be a coordinated action if it's going to work. So they arrived in the months leading up to D-Day. They organised drops of ammunition so that these men had something to fight with. And they trained them up in sabotage.
This is incredibly dangerous work for these women who were dropped behind enemy lines.
So wireless operator, they were so important because that was the means of communication to relay information from France back to London. And it's estimated that a wireless operator had a life expectancy of about 6 weeks in the field. The radios were very large, very cumbersome, and they were carried around in a suitcase, and you had to sort of do it in a way that didn't look like you were limping underneath the weight of it. And they weren't quick to set up. They required very large aerials, which were very conspicuous. And the Germans certainly became much more proficient in tracking down these signals. So they had big vans, and they would detect, like the television, detector vans. Yeah. And you really had very limited windows in which you could transmit back. And the pressure on these people just to keep on the move and keep ahead of being caught was so stressful.
I think you've got one extraordinary story of a woman who was almost caught by the Nazis but managed to escape.
So it was, as the D-Day landings were happening, there was one woman who was corresponding back to London and just saying, this is what's going on. And some Germans who were caught on the back foot and fleeing from all the bombardment suddenly ran into the barn or the house where she was operating from, and she only just managed to slam the suitcase shut, conceal the radio, and they were asking for food, and she just played the innocent card and just said, oh, I'm just a poor girl with scarlet fever waiting to be shipped off to the country to be recuperated, and they immediately recoiled and said, "We'll find food somewhere else. It's fine. It's fine."
But anyway, she survived. Many others did not, and true tales of heroism. Elisabeth Shipton, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Author and historian Elisabeth Shipton.